Kamal, we're going to talk about tissues. When we think about tissues, it's basically what is our body made out of? So we have groups of cells that clump together that perform similar functions. And we've got four types of tissues in our body. Epithelial tissues, that's mostly linings. Connective tissue, that makes up the majority of our body. Muscle tissue, we know that one pretty well. And nervous tissue, that sends impulses through our body. So let's talk first about epithelial tissue. The most easy to understand example is our skin. Think about our skin for a minute. Well, we know some of the things it does is protect us from the environment around us. It also performs things like absorption. Think of somebody who's taken the nicotine patch, for example, to quit smoking. Shout out to them. That's awesome. They're counting on absorption of nicotine through their skin. Some epithelial tissue can also perform filtration, and it can perform secretion. A good example of secretion is sweating onto your skin. So yes, epithelial tissue, we're going to talk about things like skin. We're also going to talk about some linings in our body, like the pericardium, the lining around our heart, the linings, around our heart. Also, if we look at a gland, like a sweat gland or a sudoriferous gland, they have a little lining as well, and that lining is made of epithelial tissue. The funny thing about epithelial tissue is it doesn't have any of its own blood vessels, so it relies on diffusion of oxygen, for example, from underlying structures. Usually it can regenerate well, so think about your skin. If you scratch some of your skin off, it's not like that never regenerates itself. It will actually regenerate itself. Fun. The way that we sort of name epithelial tissue is kind of a fun way. First off, we start off with the term, it's either simple or stratified. And just as it says, simple means that it has one layer of cells, and stratified means it has multiple layers of cells. For example, if you were looking at a pile of pancakes, that would be stratified, more than one layer. Shapes of cells. Squamous means flat. Cuboidal, just like it sounds like, it's like a cube, and columnar is just like it sounds like. So a lot of times we'll use the term stratified squamous. Well, now we know that means more than one layer of flat cells. An example of that is in the skin. The top example is simple squamous, one layer of flat cells. The bottom example is stratified squamous. I'm calling it that because the apical surface, the outer surface, has flat cells, so that's how we determine which term we're going to use with that. And it's stratified because it's multi-layered. I should just mention the term basal surface, that's the inside layer. So why does epithelium have different types of structures? Like, why is it simple, one layered in some places and stratified in other places? Why are the cells flat versus cuboidal or columnar? It's because of what they need to be able to do. So let's think about your alveoli. Your alveoli are the sacs in your lungs where oxygen needs to be able to cross easily, and carbon dioxide needs to cross as well in the opposite direction. So you know what? It's simple squamous epithelium in there, and it probably makes sense to you. It needs to be a very thin layer in order for these gases to diffuse across. So of course it would be simple squamous. Another really good example would be in your bladder. Let's talk about, what is happening in your bladder. Well, it's made of something called transitional epithelium, which means that it changes shape just depending on how distended it is. So you can sort of understand that the shapes of these things depend on their function. I think it's really important to understand that the lining of your capillaries is also simple squamous. So one layer of flat cells. That's because in our capillaries, we expect oxygen to be able to go out to the cells in our tissues and CO2 to come back into the blood. So it has to be able to move very easily. So we need to have a very thin layer, hence the simple squamous. Let's talk about simple cuboidal, one layer of cube sort of cells. A really good example is in the kidney tubules. The cells of the kidney tubules are kind of like smart cells. We're going to learn that they play a role in determining what is in your urine. We want to send bad things out in our urine, and make sure that no good things go out in our urine. And these very smart cuboidal cells in the kidney tubules do that job. Also, I just want to add the term ciliated. So a cell that has cilia on it has small little hairs that are able to whip along things like mucus that are over top of them. So they create movement of the fluids or anything that is above it. If we were to look at your small intestine, put it under a microscope, we would see it's one layer of column-shaped cells, so simple columnar. These cells have a very important job in your small intestine because their job is mainly to absorb broken down food products. So that is simple columnar epithelium lining your small intestine, in your gut, as it says here. They have some functions in absorption, like I said. They also function to secrete things as well. And some of them have cilia. Some simple columnar epithelium have cilia, which we know that ciliated cells are able to beat or whip along any liquids that are above them. Well, isn't this a fancy term? Pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Okay, pseudo means sort of fake. So, sort of the term fakely stratified looking columnar epithelium. The way that the cells are designed, it looks like there are multiple layers, when in fact each cell touches the basement membrane or the tissue below it. So an example of this is in the respiratory tract, ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium or pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. That's a real mouthful. But it means it looks like it's multi-layered, but it's not. It's single layered. It has cilia on it to beat the mucus in the airway, and it's a column shaped. Love all these terms. Stratified squamous epithelium. The great example is our skin. It has many, many layers. Also our mouth and our esophagus. Just think about when you're eating a nacho and all the sharp corners of a nacho. We want to have a good layer of protection there in order that the tissues don't get damaged. So maybe that might help you remember that in the mouth and the esophagus, it's stratified squamous, multi-layered flat cells. Transitional epithelium. We had the example of in the bladder that the cells are going to look different when they're stretched. If you're really holding your bladder and it's really full of urine, let's say it has about 750 mils in it, which is a lot, those cells are going to really be stretched, so they're going to look different than if you've just emptied your bladder and the bladder's fully empty. Then those cells are going to appear differently, so they're called transitional. So in the body, different things are going to be secreted. Think about our saliva, for example, or mucus. Those are some good examples of fluids that are excreted. These fluids that are excreted in our body, interestingly, can be secreted by single cells in some situations, or by a little bit more complex structure called a gland. So when we look at glands, there are endocrine and exocrine glands. Let's talk about exocrine glands first, because they're the easiest to understand. Exocrine glands secrete a substance that exits onto the surface, so it has EX in it. So, for example, on our skin, there are glands, or in our skin, pardon me, there are glands like sweat glands that produce a substance, sweat, that has a duct, pardon me, the gland has a duct, and the sweat is ejected onto the surface of the skin, so it exits onto the surface of the skin. So, endocrine glands are different than that. They don't have this little duct or tube opening. They simply excrete something like hormones, and they rely on the bloodstream around them to just pick up the hormones. So an endocrine gland simply sort of ejects or spits out some hormone randomly around its own tissue, and it just expects the bloodstream to sort of pick up the hormone. This is because of diffusion. So connective tissue is the one that we probably know the least about as a layperson, but it makes up the most amount of our body. If you like chicken wings, you probably enjoy eating a lot of connective tissue because chicken wings are made up with a lot of ligaments and tendons, and those are considered connective tissues because they connect parts of a structure. So that's where the term comes from. They're kind of an interesting group because there's a lot of different types of connective tissues, so bear with me in the next few slides. I'm going to have a review of lots of different connective tissues. Some of them have a really good blood supply, and some of them have no blood supply. If they have no blood supply, those connective tissues are difficult to heal. So if you damaged a tendon or ligament, for example, you may have trouble with healing. The interesting thing is they all have an extracellular matrix, which is considered non-living material that surrounds a cell. It's kind of like the house you live in. So you live in a house, you're alive and living, but the structure of the house that you're in is not alive. You know, it's a non-living material. So if that helps you understand, connective tissue is kind of like the way we live in our house. We've got living cells in an extracellular matrix. What is this extracellular matrix, or sort of like the house that the cell lives in? Well, it's called ground substance. So I should say it's made up mostly of ground substance. Like if we look at blood, the ground substance is considered water, for example. So it's the main structure of the building that the cells are living in, basically. But there are other things like fibers called collagen, elastin, and reticular fibers. And they have slightly different colors, and they form some of the structure that the living cells are going to be in. Bone is one of the easiest connective tissues to understand. If we think about a bone, you know, most of it is this hardened mineral. That's the house that the living cell lives in. So we know that inside of that bone there must be some living cells in there, and there are. We're going to be learning all about that. And it really helps you understand that there's a non-living structure component of that organ. So bone is a very good example of connective tissue. Cartilage has chondrocytes. These are the living cells inside of cartilage. And of course they have extracellular matrix as well. Kind of like the structure that a bone is, except we know that cartilage is more flexible than bone, isn't it? Here are some examples: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. Now let's take a look at those. Let's talk about hyaline cartilage for a moment. If you are caring for a newborn that has a disorder called tracheomalacia, I'm not going to ask you about this on an exam question, by the way, it's just to kind of put it in context. But if you have a newborn afflicted with tracheomalacia, what that means is that the cartilage in the trachea is not properly formed, and it's quite flimsy, I guess I'd say. So every time the infant tries to take a breath in, the windpipe or the trachea actually collapses. So you can appreciate then that the hyaline cartilage of the trachea is not structurally strong enough yet in that newborn. It can be a bit of a dangerous disorder because every time they try to take a deep breath in, they're having collapse of the windpipe. That can require surgery if it's significant enough or problematic enough. They usually also outgrow it, which is good. So anyway, that kind of highlights the point about hyaline cartilage. It's quite abundant. If we look at it with the naked eye, it looks glassy and kind of rubbery. And the locations are listed here, including the trachea. Also, when we look at how the ribs connect to the sternum, the breastbone, there's actually a little bit of hyaline cartilage there that sort of forms that connection. And it covers the end of long bones. It's called articular cartilage in that case. And if we look at the fetal skeleton before birth, the whole skeleton at one point is made up of hyaline cartilage. And these are all very interesting points. The growth plate, when we're growing, let's say if we could look at ourselves when we were 10 years old, we would see that we had a line of cartilage at the end of each long bone, and that was where the bone could grow in length. So that's pretty interesting. It actually eventually solidifies into bone once we are done growing, so, you know, late puberty or at the end of puberty. And then we just have an epiphyseal line there instead of cartilage. Elastic cartilage is pretty flimsy. It's in our ears. fibrocartilage is very important. It makes up most of the intervertebral discs. These discs are the cartilage between our vertebrae. If you take a moment to think about your vertebrae, they're all stacked on top of each other, and they have to bear the weight of your head, don't they, and your upper body. So they have to be there to sort of cushion the impact that would be occurring between your vertebrae. Imagine if you're jumping up and down and all the impact on those vertebrae. So it's nice that there is some fibrocartilage there in between. Let's look at a category of connective tissue called dense connective tissue. This would be, for example, tendons, ligaments, and the layer underneath of our top layer of skin, so our lower layer of skin called the dermis. What these have in common is that they have a cell called fibroblasts that are living in an extracellular matrix. That extracellular matrix, or house that the fibroblasts are living in, is mostly made up of collagen fibers. So what is a tendon? Well, a tendon is what attaches a muscle to a bone, and a ligament attaches a bone to a bone. So that's why I say when you're eating chicken wings, you're getting a lot of tendons and ligaments in there. You probably remember now what those are like. So that's why there's a lot of connective tissue when you're looking at chicken wings. Loose connective tissue is made up of a few sort of odd things, such as areolar, adipose, reticular, and blood. So kind of a little odd grouping here, but it makes up a lot of our body. So let's look at what each of these types of tissues look like. It's kind of interesting to me that this is the most common type of connective tissue we have in our body, yet we actually rarely talk about this clinically, but certainly surgeons would deal with this because they need to cut through this when they perform surgery. This is like layers and layers of sort of packing material in our body. We also call it lamina propria when it's underneath of membranes. So it's kind of like the packing of our body. It describes here like tissue paper or cobwebs through our body. Well, I love to eat yummy things, so I've been building lots of this adipose connective tissue, also known as fat. And there are some great things about fat, actually, to make us feel better if we have any extra of it. For example, it keeps us insulated, so we're nice and warm, protects our organs and body, actually, as a whole. It also is some good fuel storage. If we get stranded on an island, we can dip into our reserves of fat for energy. Of course, we know that it can be below the skin, called subcutaneous tissue. It protects organs like the kidneys, so there's like a fat sort of area around the kidneys, and if one loses weight too quickly, you can actually lose weight from around your kidneys and your other organs, which is a little dangerous. And that there are sort of fat depots where we tend to accumulate more fat. Some people, it's more in the hips, some in the breasts, some in the belly, or some combination. So if we are looking inside of some organs like the spleen or lymph nodes, and we put that under a microscope, we would see reticular connective tissue. It's just the type of tissue that would be in a lymph node. And this type of tissue has some extracellular matrix, and it has some living cells that are called reticular cells. It's hard to think of blood as being a connective tissue, but that's where it's been thrown into in our classification system. So blood is considered a connective tissue, and yes, another important name of blood is vascular tissue. So we have living cells, like let's say white blood cells, and there are other cells as well in the blood, and they are living in an extracellular matrix that is mostly made up of water. So if that helps you kind of make it fit into the category of connective tissue, then it does, just like the others. It has very important jobs like carrying nutrients. Think about glucose, for example. That's sugar, right? We want to be able to carry glucose to all the cells of our body, and we do that using our blood. We need to carry waste products away from our cells. That would be things like urea, uric acid, and we need to have exchange of respiratory gases. Those would be oxygen and CO2. So it is our blood's job to transport and carry these things through the body to the tissues and picking up from the tissues. A little more straightforward. Yes, muscle tissue is a type of tissue that we have. I think we all know a bit about muscle tissue. Certainly its job is to shorten so that we can have contraction of a muscle and movement, for example, if we want to walk around the room. Three types that we're going to be studying: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. Cardiac is in your heart, it's basically your heart muscle, and smooth muscle is the muscle that's all around your gastrointestinal system and around your blood vessels. Man, we take those for granted because we don't even have to think about those. Those guys are automatic. They function without us even thinking about them. Last but not least is the wiring of our body. Just like a house would have wires that conduct information around the house, electricity I should say, around the house, our nervous tissue is like that through our body. These are made up of cells called neurons and all of their supporting cells called neuroglial cells. And their function is to be, the function of the neuron, is to be irritable, so respond to a change, and to conduct an impulse along its axons. So those are what that would be what neurons do. And then the nerve supporting cells, the neuroglial cells, really take care of the neurons and try to keep them in good shape. They insulate them, they protect them, and they support the neurons. Last but not least, this is an excellent overview of all of that connective tissue and epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue that we've been chatting about.